Welcome everyone to our Tokyo College lecture on the topic, how can atrocities of the past inspire emancipatory politics? The pink triangle in a transregional perspective from the 1970s to the 2020s. Let me first introduce today's speaker, Dr. Sébastien Tremblay. He is a lecturer and postdoctoral researcher at the Interdisciplinary Center for European Studies of Europa-Universität Flensburg, where he also co-leads the Graduate Research School for Early Career Scholars. Previously, he worked at the Cluster of Excellence Script Contestations of the Liberal Script and was a visiting scholar at the Center for Queer History at Goldsmiths, University of London. Dr. Tremblay is a member of the DFG-funded international network Queer Contemporary History in German-speaking Europe. He obtained his PhD in 2020 from the Graduate School of Global Intellectual History at FU Berlin, and he is widely published on queer history, German history, and transnational and global history. His first monograph on queer memory and visual conceptual history, A Badge of Injury, the Pink Triangle as Global Symbol of Memory, was published by De Gruyter in 2023 and has already received a research award of the Europa-Universität Flensburg. Thank you so much for joining, and Sébastien, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. Thank you for this very nice introduction. Let's just see if everything functioning right now. Yes, that's great. Yeah, I'm very, very happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for organizing this. And thank you for anyone who's joining us now online a little bit later. Yes, I'm going to be talking for about 35 minutes, and then we're going to have a conversation about the topic afterward. So this talk is based on the book that Professor Haas just mentioned, A Badge of Injury, the Pink Triangle, the Global Symbol of Memory. And I will just start basically with this image of a manga. Here's like the translation, of course, in English, of a manga by Kango Otagame, My Brother's Husband, which I think kind of, brings together a lot of the things I'm going to be discussing today. So this is the story of a Canadian man who lost his husband and travels to Japan to meet the brother of his late husband, his brother being a twin brother. And it's how they're basically like dealing with a queer member of the family coming to Japan. And what I find particularly interesting on this cover is how the Canadian man is being represented. So we have a beer-scruffed man here on the left side of the cover, with the, I would argue, kind of stereotypical Canadian shirt, but also a pink triangle on his t-shirt underneath his shirt. This pink triangle is basically going to follow us across the talk today. I'm going to use this as I use it in my book to map the journey of queer memory of National Socialism and queer persecution of the 20th century throughout the post-war era until today. So that's why the talk is entitled, How Can Atrocities of the Past Inspire Emancipatory Politics? But the pink triangle in a transregional perspective from the 1970s to 2020s. So let me start. Yes. Okay. Just so for everyone to follow what I'm saying, I just want to start with the basic of what I mean when I'm talking about the pink triangle. So the pink triangle is one of the many symbols used by the Nazi perpetrators during the Second World War to mark different status in the concentration camp, in the death camps. So you probably have all heard of concentration camps during National Socialism in various territories in Europe that were ruled and occupied by the Germans. So you probably already know about the yellow star, which was used also to mark people of Jewish faith in the camps, so Jews in the camps. But there were many of those triangles. For example, the red triangles were for so-called political prisoners. We have different categories of victimhood, different categories created by the perpetrators. And the pink triangle was the triangle used to brand in concentration camp people who were deported because of homosexuality. It may sound a little bit clingy the way I'm mentioning this. I'm not saying homosexuals, I'm not saying queer men in concentration camp. This is very important for me. I'm going to be mentioning this a couple of times during this talk today. Because I cannot know for sure how the people in those camps were identifying themselves or identifying their sexuality, or if they were identifying their sexuality at all. So maybe those were bisexual men, maybe those were men who had sex or desire for men, but did not have a word like homosexuality to define themselves. And maybe it was also, and we have, my colleague Buddy Ashton has worked on this, we have people in the archives who were trans women, but were deported for homosexuality by the Nazis, considering those trans women actually homosexual men. So we have a lot of violence included in those categories, and I don't want to reproduce it while discussing. But this symbol is very interesting for us because I'm going to try to understand why this symbol evolved from this famous poster that you can see on the slide of the concentration camp of Dachau. This is in Bavaria. So showing all those categories, how is the pink triangle moving from this poster, this dreadful poster showing violence, to the t-shirt of a Canadian character in a manga in Japan? That's a long journey, and this is the journey we're going to be taking today. So let's start again with this poster and let's try to understand how this basically like traveled from one poster to the cover. We are in a university, so I'd like to start this journey also in a university. We are not here in Germany, we're not in Japan, we're actually in Canada. We are seeing two posters. On the left, you have a poster from the University of Guelph in the 80s. And this is the publicity flyer for a dance, a gay dance, from a group on campus, basically saying, please come to our pink triangle dance, right? So the symbol, this dreadful symbol of the Nazis, the symbol of violence, suddenly seems to be a symbol of joy. It's a symbol that invites people to come together. It's a symbol of belonging to some kind of queer community. And on the right, you have a postcard of Pink Triangle Day. This is celebrated by some organizations in Canada, where I come from, and where people on the 14th of February, to basically disrupt the heteronormativity of Valentine's Day, celebrate Pink Triangle Day, and wish each other a happy Pink Triangle Day. This is connected to a court case that was won by Pink Triangle Press in Ontario. I'm going to spare you the details. But again, we're asking ourselves, okay, how did that happen that people in Canada are wishing each other a happy Pink Triangle Day? Why are they making publicity for a dance with a pink triangle? Is that the same pink triangle, or is that just a completely different symbol? In the 80s, at the same time that with this dance being organized in Canada, you have on the same concentration, like on the ground of the former concentration camp in Dachau, where the poster comes from, a demonstration in '87 of mostly gay men demonstrating for the memory of the men or the people who were deported for homosexuality and who were wearing the pink triangle, forced to wear the pink triangle in the concentration camp. And here you can see a picture of that demonstration. They are like wearing posters also with the pink triangle. And they have a lot of demands, but two of those demands are basically to remember the people who were in the camp and marked with the pink triangle, and also a complete radiation of the law against homosexuality in Germany. So it's very important for you to know the law that was used by the Nazis to deport people for homosexuality is called Section 175. This law is not a Nazi law, it's a law that comes prior from the Nazis during the Prussian era, was made worse by the Nazis in 1935. The alliteration by the Nazis was not changed until 1969 in West Germany, and then reformed a couple of times until it was completely eradicated in 1994. So here you have people like asking for this law to be completely repealed in 1987. Those men were identifying with the men in the camp, right? With the people in the camp. They were talking only about gay men back then in the camp, right? They were not using this formulation I'm using. And basically, they're saying this could have been us, because those men that you see in that demonstration, they were born in 1969. So they could have been, deported for homosexuality as well. And they're saying we not only need to remember the people who were wearing the pink triangle, but we're wearing the pink triangle as well, because it could have been us. So you have here like an inversion of the emancipation aspect, right? But how did that happen? And so I brought you here a quote from the cool thing about working on groups from the 70s and 80s is that they write everything, and they write everything about the decision they're taking. And so when they were discussing the past and they were discussing the pink triangle, they also wrote a lot about it. So here I have a quote for you that the German original is in the bottom of the slide, but in English, sure, the forms have changed, the forms of oppression, right? But oppression and discrimination continue to spread. This new tendency to pretend that things are changing clearly shows the danger that hypocritical tolerance can quickly turn back into active persecution. It is therefore important to recognize the beginning of a new push toward the right and to counter it. We gays must never let ourselves be pushed into a ghetto, not even as a tolerated minority. We have to get out of our hiding places and at least try to live our sexuality and drive freely and openly. There's a lot of this quote that can also resonate with us today, right? Like what tolerance actually brings instead of acceptance. But they are basically looking at, right-wing politics in the 1970s and then in the 1980s and saying like, well, we know where that can lead. We remember like the pink triangle. So they are using it. And a lot of people are using this pink triangle. This is not only the 70s and 80s. I like to make this a little bit more concrete. So I asked some of my friends who have pink triangle tattoos to talk to me about their tattoos and to send me pictures. So we have 3 different men here from 3 different places. We have this in Bristol, so a drag performer in Bristol using the pink triangle tattoo on their forearms. We have Dirk from Amsterdam, who's working in archives. And we have Christopher from West Lafayette in Indiana, who's a professor of queer history, who also has a pink triangle on his arms. I would like you to remember that those pink triangles all look to seem that they're like pointing down. We're going to come back to this, but because this is on an arm, you can move it all around. And then we're going to talk a little bit more what it means afterward, where the pink triangle can be put in different kind of ways. But we have here an embodiment of the pink triangle, right? We have someone who is voluntarily tattooing the pink triangle on their arm. So people in concentration camp did not have a choice to wear it on their uniform, and they are actually going one step further. They are inscribing it on their body, which is a very, very radical act of marking. Why are they doing this? When the Nazis were, marking, they were not tattooing, but they were marking homosexuals, queer individuals in this kind of similar way. Is that the same pink triangle? I'm still keeping coming back to this story, right? Is that the same pink triangle? I'm bringing you on another part of this journey. We're now on the west coast of the United States. We're in California, and every year there's a group of activists, of human rights activists, who put a humongous pink triangle on a hill over San Francisco to remember people who have died because of homophobia and to make a statement against homophobia, queerphobia, transphobia, biphobia, every kind of discrimination interphobia, and every discrimination connected to queerness. And then I'm asking myself, is that the same pink triangle? This is again, it has a completely new proportion, right? If we go across the archives and we go across North America, we see a lot of those pink triangles. I brought you here 3 examples. So identity-wise, this means a lot. We have the Asian Queer Pacific Proud group in Denver using the pink triangle in the 90s. We have here Irish lesbians and gays using the pink triangle. So this is not in Ireland, this is in Boston. And then you also have in Milwaukee another pride banner from the 90s using the pink triangle. Here, interestingly, I guess you're following me and you're believing me that the triangle here is pink, even though it's a black and white picture. This says a lot about how, well, not only how you trust me, but also how when we put images together, the visuals make something with us, right? And because I am talking about the pink triangle, you kind of associated the pink triangle already. I can assure you, I've seen this picture in the archives in colors. This is also a pink triangle. So the pink triangle seems to be very anchored in North America as well, but also in Germany at the same time. But the people in Germany seem to use it in a different kind of way. So what are we doing with this? Are we facing here a synchronicity of the pink triangle, or is it diachronic? Is it different over time in different places? Is it the same pink triangle? I have kind of a broken cassette here, but I'm trying to ask the question, right? And so let's try to understand why people recuperated this. Here I brought you a flyer from an action on the boulevard Kudamm in Berlin. This is one of the main shopping streets in West Berlin. And basically we have people from the Homosexual Action West Berlin, so the Homosexual Action West Berlin, who is one of the first group in West Germany to recuperate this symbol in the 1970s. And they are saying in this flyer, we are gays. We want to be seen. We want to be remembered. And so they're making this connection to the past. They're saying this could have been us, but I told you what these other people in those demonstrations were doing. But they're also saying we're going to rebrand ourselves with the pink triangle. They're saying we are taking place in the public space. We are confronting people with the pink triangle. So not only are we like trying to historicize queerness, we're saying like we were always there, and when we are persecuted, we still survive. But they're saying as well, take us seriously. We're in the street. We're not hiding anymore. We are branding ourselves. In the past, fascists have branded us. Now we are the one choosing to brand ourselves. So there's a very like an emancipatory like feeling here, like this inversion of the persecution in some kind of emancipatory politics. And of course, I have a quote for this because we were discussing this in many pamphlets. And here we have Almut, one of those activists, who is saying in a pamphlet about the pink triangle, one of the reasons I wear the pink triangle is because I read the book, The Man with the Pink Triangle, which is the memoirs of someone who survived the camp, which is clearly showing the Nazis' torture of gay in concentration camps and the oppression of the gays by other camp inmates. For the first time in my life, I felt personally affected by this story. I could fully identify with the gays in the camp. I could feel their pain physically. So what I really want to point out here is that those people in the 1970s, they're not just instrumentalizing the past to make a point in the present. They're really feeling that it could have been them. They're reading about people who die in the camps or who survive in the camps. And they're saying this could have been me. So there's an identification process here. There's a kind of a second generation trauma happening, even if it's not in the context of the family, right? Like we could argue that this is the context of the community. And I would argue that the post-memory, that the transfer of memory and trauma can also work in that way. So I don't want to dismiss the fact that those people were really feeling the same. And so this happened all across the Euro-American world. I can find you examples in France, in the Netherlands, in Spain, in Canada, in the US, and this goes on for a while. And then the HIV/AIDS crisis hit at the end of the 80s, and this symbol of emancipatory politics seems to play then a very important role, almost a bigger role. There's a group that's created to fight the silence of the government in the United States, and that becomes an international coalition. It's the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, short ACTA. Basically, they're acting up, right? And they are creating new material, new visual material, in order to fight this epidemic and fight also new discrimination that queer people were facing during that period, all across the world, basically. And one of the posters it comes with is this silent equal death poster. This poster is basically denouncing the silence of the government, the inaction of the government. And interestingly, they are using the pink triangle. They're using the pink triangle and they're saying, if we are not doing anything, we are facing a new genocide. This is the argument that they're saying, right? They're saying like AIDS is a new form of genocide because the government is not doing anything and queer people are dying. And so there's this really interesting interview with one of the creators of this poster from the collective Grand Fury, which was part of ACT UP at first, Avram Finkelstein, who's saying in an interview with Sarah Schulman, who was also a member of ACT UP and a very brilliant scholar and writer. The pink triangle, at first, we hated because it entailed victimhood, obviously, but it seems like it might have the most chance of being clear enough to the lesbian and gay communities. More clear than the other images we were discussing that were abstract and graphic enough to be intriguing. And then they go on, then for a long time we thought about designing a new logo, a new image for the lesbian and gay community. But we realized, talking about it, that it would be a simple, like, you know, another campaign. And people were dying and they actually like really needed to do something. Then they said, we like the inclusiveness of the rainbow. The rainbow flag was created in the 1970s, so we like the inclusiveness of the rainbow, but it also had a little hippie baggage, and so they were not really for the rainbow, right? And then they continue. Ultimately, however, it was the graphics, so the rainbow, that disqualified it. We decided it would make an ugly poster. We prefer the feminist empowerment tonalities of the Labrys. So the Labrys is the battle axe of the Amazons, which is also a symbol of the lesbian movement. But we knew that many men would be unacquainted with it, and it would be hard to connect to some of the issues at hand. And so finally, they went with the pink triangle. And if you look at like what they're doing and what they're saying, they inverse the pink triangle pointing up because they said it was for a symbol of hope, right? They were inversing this already inverse symbol of persecution, bringing it upward. Interestingly, this is kind of a domino effect of history. If you look at the memoirs of Aaron Finkelstein that he published in 2017, he says that like the person who was supposed to check if the triangle was pointing down or up in the concentration camp didn't do his job. And then the poster was already published, which I think is a very cute little domino effect of history. But it still remained that afterwards they were saying that it was because it was a symbol of hope, right? So it doesn't change the story. Before I continue, I just want to point out that this whole story that I'm going to tell you today is a story of inclusion, but also a story of exclusion. And you really have a good example here that I think, as a cis white gay man, I need to point out and at least underline once. This here. We prefer the feminist empowerment tonalities of the Labris, but we knew many men would be unacquainted with it, and it would be hard to connect to some of the issues at hand. So basically, here we have something very typical inside the various tensions of the queer community, where a symbol that is not associated with gay liberation or not associated with cis white gay men, that's a symbol that everyone is supposed to connect with. But when we have a symbol, for example, here, a symbol of the lesbian movement, then gay men cannot connect with it. Like we need to find another symbol. And keep that in mind because a lot of the things connected to the pink triangle is this kind of assumption. Everyone, it's universalized, everyone should be able to connect to those kind of persecution. But gay men apparently cannot with other symbols. So are those the same pink triangles? I'm bringing this back to my question. What are we doing with this? Here on the right, you have running shoes created by Nike in 2018. Every year, Nike, many other brands, as you might know, release for Pride a new kind of collection of rainbow capitalism that people can buy. In 2018, Nike released this walking with history part of the collection where you could buy a running shoe with a pink triangle on it. And the idea was that you could walk with your own history. And so I'm asking here, beyond what we might think of this or not from a capitalist or anti-capitalist perspective, is that the same pink triangle? Is people really walking with history, or is that something completely different? And sometimes the pink triangle seems to be pointing down and pointing up at the same time. Here we have another demonstration from 1987, in Bavaria. Please believe me, again, the reddish triangle on this picture is actually pink, if you look at the original pictures. And you have it's a demonstration against new measures by the Bavarian government that were very drastic and very discriminatory against people who were living with HIV. And basically, those are people demonstrating, mostly gay men, demonstrating against those politics. On the left, you have someone in this demonstration using a poster that says, "Hey Bavaria, did you forget this?" with a pink triangle on barbed wire, which is a clear connection to the concentration camp. And back then, politicians in Bavaria were also talking about konzentrieren, so putting back people also in concentration camp. They were talking about reopening concentration camp, not for forced labor, but to concentrate people who were living with HIV. The term they used back then was infected. And then on the right, you have, again, a German translation of this idea of silence equal death, so Schweigen equal Tod. ACT UP, this is the members of ACT UP Munich. So the coalition made it to Germany, but the pink triangle is not pointing up, it's pointing down. What are we doing with this? Is it the same pink triangle? Is it pointing up and down at the same time? Does that matter? Same thing with the tattoos, right? Does that matter? And now I'm going to stop asking questions and I'm going to answer those questions. So here, I'm using the words of a colleague of mine who does amazing work. So I'm criticizing one of his quotes here, but I just want to point out I'm using this as a kind of for the sake of the argument. But Klaus Müller does amazing work on queer history in the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. But he was giving an interview in the 90s, and he said, he was talking about the pink triangle back then, which was everywhere. Symbols have a way of losing their power and their meaning as they're absorbed into consumer culture until they become so neutrally ubiquitous that no one really sees them anymore. And then he continues a little bit where you can see the second pink triangle. Müller will not wear one, he will not wear a pink triangle. It's a Nazi invention. It has no other historical significance. Most ethnic gay men in Germany, in Europe, especially in Germany, won't wear one. So you can see that's not the case. A lot of people in Germany were also wearing one. But I really want to point out to this aspect of it has no other historical significance. I think I already proved to you with all my questions that this is not the case, but let's go a little bit more deeper for the rest of the talk today. So shameless plug for my book. On the right here, you see the book where I'm basically going into this, like I'm asking those questions in much more details. The book was published by the Goethe in 2023. And if you are part of a university, most universities in the world, across the world, have a license to the Goethe, so you can also download this book for free, but it is unfortunately not open access. So what I'm thinking about when I'm like, writing this book, what I was thinking about is that visual seems to be a two-way street, right? Like we ascribe discourse on visuals, on symbols, but they also influence us depending on the context where we encounter those symbols. So how are we influenced by images? How are we influencing images? And what can symbols like the pink triangle tell us about memory, about queer history? And apparently, it's difficult to understand queer history in just like a national container, right? It's difficult to understand queer history without a little bit, at least, try to understand globally or transnationally what that means. And this is what I was trying to do in this book and trying to convey today in those 35 minutes that I am doing and having with you, having the chance to have with you. So for the rest of the talk today, I'm going to go through three things that I want to mention regarding the use of those images for queer history. So first, what can a visual history of gay liberation tell us about the construction of a gay past? So this idea of like, historicization of a queer subject, of like there was always queer people. What can we do with that about a community that survived something so evil as National Socialism, and how is this connected to victimhood? Two, how is it connected to discourse of exclusion in the queer present? I think this is very important. As I told you, it is already connected to some kind of universalization. And then, because I am outside of the Euro-American world, giving you this talk right now, I also want to connect global history and queer history together and see how this kind of like universalization of a queer, white Euro-American history has repercussions all across the world. So those are the two conclusions that I came to when I was writing this book. So it's basically what I just told you, right? The creation of a historical subject is connected to knowledge about the past, the transfer of this knowledge between people, and also how we need to understand this very particular Euro-American story of queerness in order to provincialize this. This means that like it's a big provincializing is like just another way of saying the history of queer people in Europe or in the Euro-American world, if we include North America or the settlers colonies of North America, is just one aspect of a bigger story of queerness. And so as much as we need to deprovincialize queerness from the rest of the world inside the Euro-American world, we need to also like understand the Euro-American world beyond this kind of like very Eurocentric universalization of queerness. And so I'm not the only one doing this. I have two colleagues who wrote like fantastic books. So I just want to point them to you in order to further also this discussion. So Jake Newsom wrote Pink Triangle Legacies with Cornell University Press, also around 25 euros if you want to buy it for an academic book. I think that's not that expensive. Who is like trying to understand this story of memory as well from a different angle than I am. And then this wonderful book by a colleague and friend, Jennifer Evans, from Carleton University, who wrote with Duke University Press, The Queer Art of History, Queer Kinship After Fascism, where she's trying to understand this whole story also through art and through other forms of fraught relationships. So like through, evil and bad, ambiguous people who are also connected to queerness. And so, illustrating this story with a more concrete example, let's go back to this book that I mentioned through the quotes I gave you from this activist, right? The Man with the Pink Triangle. This is a book written in the 1970s. This is the story, not of a man called Heinz Heger, which is the title, like, the name of the author of the book, but a man named Joseph Koht. Joseph Koht is a man who survived a concentration camp and finished his life in Vienna. He was deported for homosexuality. He shared this story with a man called Neumann, who listened to his story and then wrote this kind of memoir, like he was himself Joseph Koht, under the pen name Heinz Heger. So it's a little bit complicated. What's important is that this book by Heinz Heger, quotation mark, The Man with the Pink Triangle, was read, translated all over the Euro-American world. It inspired a lot of queer people to rediscover what had happened during National Socialism. What we need to remember is that the persecution of queer people during National Socialism there was only an atonement for it in the Bundestag, the German parliament, in 2002. So it took a long, long time. So a lot of people were reading this in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. This picture is from a Canadian magazine, written as an article written by a man called James Seeley, who was studying in Berlin, who learned about the pink triangle, contacted people from the homosexual Berlin, I'm sorry, and got into activism with that, and then started to report on the history of homosexuality in Germany. And this pink triangle in the center of this page in the Canadian magazine was one of the first times the pink triangle appeared in North America. This inspired a Jewish American gay man called Martin Sherman to write a theater play about the fate of men in concentration camp. For him, gay men in concentration camp, I would argue again, people deported for homosexuality. It's the story of two men who are branded in the concentration camp of Dachau because of their alleged or because of homosexuality. And this play opened in London, was then a massive success on Broadway. Also was translated in many kind of ways. I read this piece like under my bed with a flashlight in this French version when I was 15. It also was the first contact I had with the persecution of queerness during National Socialism. This play is full of historical inaccuracies that is not important. What's important is that it also influenced a lot of people, right? And then this play was translated in German. It was translated in German. In German, it's called Rosa Winkel, which basically means pink triangle. And so the play started to be reported all over newspapers in Germany. So everyone was suddenly talking about Rosa Winkel, about pink triangle, and also learning what the pink triangle was all about in Germany. Like I went through like hundreds of theater critiques for the book of this play. And a lot of like newspapers in Germany are like, did you know that the pink triangle was used to actually for people deported for homosexuality? So as you can see in this kind of like staircase of pictures that I put you on the slide, this is very a transatlantic story. It's very difficult to disentangle this story. It's kind of happening at the same time. It's many pink triangle. It's many like mention of the pink triangle that means like the same thing but different thing at the same time. And so beyond an act of recovery of this past, it's very important to understand how the pink triangle was a factor of inclusion in this kind of official memory of National Socialism, but also of exclusion. Tension and erasure inside the queer community, exclusion through universalization of Euro-American memory, but also homonationalism in memory. So homonationalism, the use of queer rights to push some kind of form of patriotism, a term created by Emancipatory in the 2000s. So going now fast through those three examples in order to prove my case one last time. So here you have two pictures. The one on your right is now known by you, almost by heart. It's this poster I used to ask the question today, this poster for Dachau. But as you can see, the pink triangle, like many other triangle, well, you need to believe me because the picture is a little bit pixelized, but it's for, the Nazis used it for like men deported for homosexuality, right? This is what they had in mind, even though I already argued today that it's also for other people. But queer women, especially like lesbian women, did not have the categories of victimhood. That was a clear category created on a poster, which means for decades after the war, historians have been, fighting incessantly about like this idea of lesbian persecution during the war. A lot of lesbian scholars have been writing on this. There's a lot of material on this. I really want to underline lesbian, queer women, queer trans women, everyone who was connected to queerness was persecuted during National Socialism. But lesbian women did not have these categories of victimhood, which means that if we only use the pink triangle as a symbol, or if we always refer to categories created by the perpetrators, we kind of erase the persecution of lesbian women. And it was easy for a lot of sadly, mainly gay historians to exclude lesbian women for commemoration for a long, long time. On the left here, I really want to talk about queer joy as well. On the left here, you have something very, very, that makes me happy. It's the first time that lesbian women were commemorated with a monument on the ground of a former concentration camp. This is the concentration camp of Ravensbrück. This is in Brandenburg, in the north of Berlin. And this is like a so-called Gedenkkugel, so like a memory sphere that is commemorating the persecution of queer women. So this is a major gain. But as you can see, inclusion of one aspect, inclusion of queer men to national memory, seem to have excluded queer women. And I think this is very important to mention. If you're more interested about this, you can take the time to like pause the slide on YouTube and go see this wonderful compilation of scholarship, 30 years of scholarship on queerness, women, lesbian, trans women in Nazi Germany, compiled by my colleague Anna Heikova, who's working in Warwick on queer Holocaust history. Second point, the universalization of Euro-American memory. So here you have a poster by International Lesbian and Gay Association well, this is an international organization that is also now a consulting association at UN. But they were saying, like, it was mainly a Western organization in the beginning, and they were saying that they were representing all homosexuals from all across the world. And so on the left, you have a report on sexual minorities happening in the 80s, written for the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. And in this report, the pink triangle plays an important role. And I read, it's from this report, German homosexuals were the pink triangle in the Nazi concentration camp when they suffered just as much as communist Roma and Sinti, uncompromising Christians and Jews. And so this is much more complicated than that, right? Like it was, you had no chance of survival almost if you were Jewish when you arrived in the camp. If you were deported for homosexuality, it was also dreadful. I'm not making a hierarchy here in suffering, but it was not the same thing as being Jew or being a Roma and Sinti person. But here they goes on and they say, ever since, their movement has had its patent of nobility, right? This legitimization of queer rights is connected to National Socialism, surviving the sacred evil of the 20th century, and wearing the pink triangle. And this is suddenly used in this report for everyone around the world who is queer, right? So you have a universalization of Euro-American queer memory for everyone around the world. I'm going to skip this slide, but basically it's the same thing. Like this, sexual minority rights are always connected back in this report to quote unquote Hitler's Germany. And you have the same thing for homo-nationalism. This is the plague of the memorial since the 2000s. There's a memorial now in the Berlin Tiergarten, which is a big part, kind of a central part in the middle of Berlin. It is facing the official memorial for murdered Jews and National Socialism. It's kind of echoing this monument. And this monument has like a small plaque in front of it. You can almost miss it. And then I zoomed it in for you, like the English version. The second part is very important. Because of its history, Germany has a special responsibility to actively oppose the violation of gay men's and lesbian human rights. In many parts of the world, people continue to be persecuted for their sexuality. Homosexual love remains illegal, and a kiss can be dangerous. So not only is this memory universalized, not only is like queerness suddenly like always connected to through the pink triangle, through National Socialism and the persecution to everyone else across the world, but suddenly like homophobia doesn't seem to happen anymore in Germany, and Germany has learned from its past and now can like, you know, teaches the rest of the world about homophobia. As someone living in Germany, I can already tell you that the far right is very, very high in the polls. They have like extremely homophobic policies, and they're very part of Germany. So it's still very much happening in Germany. But this idea of using persecution of National Socialism to talk about this in a kind of homo-nationalist way is not only German. It is also US American, also Canadian, also French, also very Euro-American. And so here I'm bringing you back to the website of this project that I showed you in San Francisco, where they put this big pink triangle on the hill, right? It's called the Pink Triangle Project. And this is from their website. The test of any democracy is how well it treats its minorities. The so-called Third Reich demonstrates how easily a government can devise minority scapegoats. Branding homosexuals as criminal let most Germans feel comfortable looking the other way while the Nazis went about their persecution. Germany is today one of the gay-friendliest places on earth, with true safeguards for LGBTs. However, tactics used there so long ago still occur today in other places. So again, an externalization of, you know, Germans' past to the rest of the world. And if you look on the website, the list afterward is like a very, very focus on Muslim majority countries. And you clearly have like an undertone to this. So it's always still connected to homo-nationalism. And so to the universalization, I want to make like a last point to kind of hammer down what I was saying. There's a group in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia who is using the pink triangle pointing down for the group called Pink Triangle, which is a group for people living with HIV/AIDS, right? And they are using the pink triangle. And then when you ask yourself, why did the pink triangle end up on a manga, like I started this talk, right? It's not only because there's power asymmetries in the rest of the world, and like the Euro-American kind of like narrative has been universalized. People have agency across the world, but I'm not saying that they're only like just imposed the pink triangle. I'm saying that there seems to be like this semiotic relationship here, like for strategic gains, or maybe like this idea of they are part of an international queer community. So it goes in many ways at the same time, but it is connected still to this universalization of the queer past. And so I hope I kind of like make sense today of how following the journey of the pink triangle, trying to understand how it started in a concentration camp and ended up in a manga in Japan on a Canadian figure, how we can make sense of this kind of like transfer of knowledge and the subjectivization of queer memory to kind of queer ancestors and the creation of a queer history. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us online or in the room today.
Thank you so much, Sébastien, for this deep dive into the history of a symbol and its political uses in the past and the present. And we're now moving on to a short conversation about this lecture. I want to welcome with us also Xin Wang, who is an assistant professor here at Tokyo College, working on, among other things, migration and queer studies as an anthropologist. And I'd like to ask Xin if you would like to start us off with a question or like comment in some way.
Sure. Thank you so much, Sébastien, for the talk. I really enjoyed it a lot, especially how you manifest, the pink triangle. So basically, this past suffering is like continuously represented, and then how this basically how this symbol can actually be functioned as a collective memory that has the power to both unite people, but then also divide people. Approaching to the latter part of your talk, you have also mentioned that how this symbol has its roots in Euro-American queer memory, which basically means that it may not be able to, for example, accurately reflect the sort of like collective memory of suffering shared by like non-Euro-American queers or non-white queers. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the use of the word global in the title of your book. So what sort of like globalness are we talking about here, and what does this word mean to you, and how do you interpret it in your book?
Thank you for the comment and a very important question. So for me, the global in the title is not global as a space, but global as an argument. So what I'm trying to invoke is how, in order to understand some particular space of queer memory of the queer community, we need to understand it as like in a kind of like internationally entangled perspective. So I am not looking at like a world history of the pink triangle, but trying to start with the pink triangle as a kind of a point of departure and try to understand how it's connected to many places at the same time. This was based on my dissertations project, so I had like limitation when it came like to different archives I could basically visit, unfortunately, but there's also like magnificent archivists across the world who send me like materials, so I'm very thankful for them. And what I try to understand is how we can actually use this theory of global history in order to complicate those very universalizing narratives of queerness. Because I'm very uneasy with this idea of saying that everyone in the queer community is kind of connected to this one particular traumatic event. That makes total sense, like in a German context, and in a way also in a North American context, because the Second World War is connected to this kind of like the good war, like, you know, the war that was won against fascism. And so like this, it makes total sense, the transatlantic world, the Euro-American world. But I'm becoming very uneasy when everyone in the rest of the world is supposed to connect to National Socialism the same kind of way. And so therefore, like, I really wanted to provincialize this story, like coming from like Deepa Chakrabarty, like idea of provincializing history. And so there's so much more I need to do in order for this to be a world history of the pink triangle. I would really like to also have like kind of oral history with people using the pink triangle. So that's why I was like really underlining the fact I'm not saying that this is just imposed on people in the rest of the world, because like that would be also very paternalistic on like different kind of queer groups around the world. But I'm trying to, following this, trying to understand how those power dynamics works and why am I seeing pink triangle in, like, I've seen it in like groups in Nigeria, I've seen it in South Africa, I've seen like in many kind of ways. I understand why it's in Australia and in New Zealand, because there's some kind of connections that are like similar, but there's a group in Hong Kong that's also called, like, I've seen it so many ways, and I was trying to, with like the material that I had access to try to make sense of this. So that's why I think global here is an argument, but not, it's not a history of the global space of the pink triangle, if that makes sense.
So it's not a sort of like, for example, the global emergence of the symbol, but then how it is like creatively adapted and then localized in different sort of content.
Exactly. I think it's in the introduction of the book that I mentioned that like I invite the reader to see the pink triangle as some kind of aircraft that like carries various baggage of different people and is kind of like flying in different places of the world. And inside the aircraft, you have different classes of people, depending on like where they come from and how much money and access they have, and how sometimes the plane doesn't pick up and sometimes the planes crash. And sometimes, so I'm trying like to understand like how different groups made different kind of things with this pink triangle. Sometimes in ways that are not at all functioning with like this original recuperation in the 1970s. When I started this project, archivists in Germany were telling me, oh, you can finally tell North Americans that they should stop using this pink triangle. And people in North America were telling me, oh, you can tell the German to chill out. It's just a symbol. So there's a lot of the things here. And I forgot like one part of your question, I'm sorry, but you were mentioning like how also maybe inside the Euro-American world, BIPOC individuals could also connect to the pink triangle, because this is a very wide story. But the pink triangle is also used a lot by African Americans and like different kind of other groups that are marginalized for other reasons. But interestingly, when ACT UP is starting to brand its activism in the 80s, they are not using the San Francisco death poster in some part of New York City. In the barrio, for example, like this part of the northern Manhattan, where there's a big Latino community, Latinx community, they are using the idea of a hurricane. Like the hurricane, like taking away a lot of people. It's like fighting against the hurricane AIDS, right? Like suddenly, like the pink triangle doesn't seem to play that of a role. So I think it doesn't work always, this localization, and that's very interesting as well.
Exactly. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So if I could follow up on that, I wondered, so if you could also briefly talk about the pride flag, because it's like in so many issues that you just mentioned, they are of course connected also to this other symbol, which in some ways seems to be less localized because it's not directly connected to like a very specific atrocity of the past, right? And it seems to be more forward-looking in some way. And of course, in recent years, there's also been this move towards like the progress pride flag, which was explicitly tries to address like the issues that you just mentioned of inclusion and exclusion of different constituencies inside the queer community. But at the beginning, you mentioned that I think it was ACT UP, right? They were thinking about whether they would use whether to use the pink triangle or the pride flag, and they decided against it for a reason that it also seemed to be somehow particular, like contain a particular message. So like, can you briefly talk about this?
Yes.
Is it the same thing, something different? Is it like, are we moving forward with this kind of inclusion thing by having a symbol that seems to be visually more inclusive now, or like what is happening with that?
There's a lot of things in this. For the history of the rainbow flag, which I think I won't have time now in this kind of format to explain. If you do speak German or French, there's a good Arte documentary on this called "I Saw the Sign," which I appear in it. I'm also playing it, but it's a very good, interesting documentary on the rainbow flag. But yeah, the rainbow flag has this idea of positive inclusion, right? This idea of like we are all united in diversity. I commend the idea of people trying to bring this kind of inclusion in the community. I do find it though quite important, so I don't want to be dismissive, but it's also a little bit naive. I think all symbols, that's what I was also bringing in this talk today, all symbols, true context, and true the way we ascribe discourse and they ascribe discourse on us, are connected with inclusion and exclusion. This because like this is creating senses of belonging. When you do try to create a we, then there's always an other. So I think this other takes multiple forms. I commend the obviously progressive pride flag. I think like it's very great that it includes different kind of people into this diversity, especially people like anti and trans people who keep on being pushed by some other parts of the queer community who like finally got a seat at the table and are now trying like to push everyone else outside of this new safer space that they created inside an heteronormative world. So I think it's important. So first of all, I want to say this. I think that the rainbow flag and the pink triangle complete each other in a very interesting way. I think the pink triangle is a very good example of how injury, therefore like the name of the book, A Badge of Injury, injuries of the past, the negative past, can have a very, very great emancipatory potential, right? We look at survivorship, we look that we survived, we look at this we that was that went through all of this, and then we can create something out of it. And the rainbow flag seems to be doing the opposite, right? This idea of like this temporality between shame to pride, right? Like this moment of coming out seems to be much more important, seems to be like very pushing forward. So they seem to complement each other. The rainbow flag, though, is also connected to this exclusion because this narrative of shame to pride is also a very particular narrative that is not including every realities of queerness across the world. It's also, like, this coming out narrative is also a very Western narrative. And so, again, it's a symbol that like, and it has the potential to include a lot of people. The idea behind it is a very beautiful idea. I'm not arguing against the rainbow flag here. But it's representing a different kind of way of doing this. And so I think the pink triangle and the rainbow flag unite very well. There's a group in London, New York, and Berlin who is using a pink triangle and a rainbow triangle together. And I think they put that brilliantly together. Like it's this kind of like pride, shame, coming out, injury, negative, positive, all together. Like basically it's this fight. It's this fight for like recognition, this fight for queer rights. But every time we try to reduce it to a symbol, it's always going to be inclusion and exclusion. Would love to write a second book on the rainbow flag. Yeah. Someone wants to write it. I'm happy to read it.
Same with you.
I would just keep thinking about your talk about how these symbols and queer symbols and queer words also always create, for example, a sense of inclusion and exclusion. And for example, about the cover image you used for your presentation today, right? Based on my very personal observation, for example, in Japan, or more specifically in Tokyo, I feel like the pink triangle is rarely presented in queer spaces, for example, in this country. And even in, for example, Takame-san's comic book, we see that he used this pink triangle, but then I believe you mentioned that the guy who's wearing the pink triangle t-shirt is a Canadian guy, right? So still, it feels quite, how should I say this? I feel like he is using this pink triangle to symbolize some sort of like unfamiliarity or foreignness. And I was just keep wondering, when the Japanese readers are reading that very particular work of his, how many of them can actually, be able to identify this queer symbol? So yeah, I just feel like your talk is very inspirational.
Thank you. That's why I see it exactly the same way as you do. That's why I chose this cover, because I think there's this kind of I don't know if it's a denunciation, because I don't know Takami that much. I only read this manga, because obviously when I found it, I need to read this automatically. And so I feel it like this. I feel it's like it's marking this character as being North American. You could have used any kind of T-shirt, but it's the pink triangle. So I don't know if personally it has a reflection on the symbol, but it really seems to be this kind of like import coming to Japan. I thought it was very also fitting with me coming here and talking about the pink triangle, not only because the figure is Canadian, but also that's not that much important, but like this idea of like a Euro-American perspective coming to Japan, and like the whole history, the whole story of the book is basically about like how this Japanese character is dealing with the fact that his brother was married, was queer with this other character. So there's this maybe clash of perspective, this maybe like merging of perspective that's interesting. And so what I would love to know is that I haven't read this in Japanese because I don't speak Japanese, but I would love to know if in the original German historical concepts are already something that interests me. And because he mentioned why there's a pink triangle in the book, if I remember correctly, on the t-shirt. And I would like to know if in Japanese, it is the words for pink and triangle, or if it's like pink triangle written in katakana. Like, so, because that would be very interesting if like just the concept of the pink triangle is localized inside the text, or really also uttered. But then I would have to send you the book and my photo, and then you can tell me. But that would be very interesting.
I sadly don't remember right now which it was. But yeah, interesting question. I think it's nice that you bring in this connection to Japan and also the limits of Western-centric symbolism for the community here. Many of whom have very different concerns about what it means to be gay, and also what it means to be like proud, and how to live their life in a like hetero mainstream society, of course. So that's an important reminder. One last question I wanted to ask you is about the question of the reception in mainstream society of this symbol, because you talked a lot about the meaning of this symbol for the queer community, which is of course very important. But I wanted to ask you if you could go briefly into, of course, like it's again a different book, I feel, or a different lecture. But if you could briefly like talk about like how did, perhaps especially initially when like queer people did this for the first time, you know, when they confronted the majority society with like their own atrocities against queer people, like how did people react to that in mainstream society? Did it change anything? Did it have an effect on mainstream society as well, or was it mostly, especially in the early years and decades, or mostly a symbol that was used to rally people inside the community?
This is a big question. So first of all, I just want to point out that this history of the pink triangle inside the queer community is also contested, right? Like there's a, for example, very short, in Cologne, in the city of Cologne, it's a city in West Germany, there was a group, the two groups were organizing an action. One was called the Gay Liberation Front Cologne in English, and the other one was called the Schwule Aktion Köln, which means the Gay Action Cologne. And they were talking about action that would happen in like one of the main streets as well, similar to like the Homosexuelle Aktion Westerli that I present and discussed today. And the Gay Liberation Front Cologne did not want to use the pink triangle because they was afraid that it could re-traumatize people. In the minutes of the protocol, like the minutes of the meeting that I read in the archives, I'm not sure if they mean re-traumatizing people in the action that would have been survivors, or if they mean people on the street that might have been survivors. I think they mean the latter because they don't seem to have survivors in the group. In most of those groups, it's many young people who were not in the camp at all. And then finally, like the group decided not to do the action together. So like there's like contestation also that needs to be pointed out. So a lot of people reacted badly to this mention of those kind of persecution. Like let's focus maybe like on Germany for this setup, because otherwise it becomes too big. So a lot of people, like, we need to understand that until 1969, before like the first reform of the paragraph 175, this law, like homosexuality was obviously criminalized, right? Like, so even the Allies, when they liberated like people from Nazi Germany, when the Nazi lost, they did not consider this law from 1935, this paragraph that was like reinforced by the Nazis, right? They did not even consider this Nazi law because they said this was a law that was prior to National Socialism. Obviously, the US Americans were also, and like all the Allies were also homophobic, right? Like, so for them, it was not a problem. So some people who went in concentration camp and were deported for homosexuality ended up after liberation to also be in prison to finish their sentence, right? Like there's this famous saying by homosexual historian, liberation was only for others. Like this, you know, like there's a continuity here. there's a lot of continuities from National Socialism in West Germany, and this is one of them. And so it takes ages for people like to be recognized. And so when they go on the street, they have this inward and outwards impulse, right? Like this inward impulse of creating a we, like we would have been persecuted as well, we would have suffered as well, therefore we are a we. We're also a we in history. We're a we have queer ancestors. We can relate to ancestors, we have history. But there's also an outward impulse, right? This is like we exist. Like you cannot look away. We're branding each other again. You branded us before, we are branding each other again. But this does not work automatically. There are other survivors who are against this. There are other survivors, so former political prisoners, former Jewish prisoners were saying pink triangle that did not exist in the camps. There are some who say, yeah, but pink triangle were for people who were pedophile. Or there are people who say pink triangle were actually the ones who were working with the Nazis. So I remember being tortured by a pink triangle. So like, why would we give them any kind of this? It's really complicated. Throughout this history in the second part of the 20th century, there's even like quite an anti-Semitic resentment inside the queer community as well. There's like this mythos that more queer men were killed than Jews at some point. That quote unquote, that's not my saying, Jews stole the spotlight with their Holocaust. So like there's a lot of anti-Semitism inside the queer community as well. Experiences of queer Jewish people are completely invisibilized also into those kind of saying, like the intersectional approach here is completely inexistent in that time. So in demonstration, people go with pink triangle. In demonstration, like against the big demonstration in Strasbourg at some point, a lot of like queer activists from Germany, from France, like they go there, they wear pink triangle, and they're being shouted at by other demonstrators, basically going, "We should reopen the gas chamber for you," right? It's very difficult, but from both sides, when they're being asked, when a lot of queer activists who were not survivors of the camps, but who are wearing pink triangles, right? When they're going at some point to one of the concentration camps, to like on the former ground of the concentration camp, in a commemoration with survivors, they are being asked not to wear the pink triangle because other survivors would be triggered. They are frustrated by this. They see that as homophobia, and they arrive to the commemoration ceremonies with a big banners that says your silence is the same as the Nazis, and they are wearing pink triangle. So there's difficulty, like there's the fraught moment of friction throughout the 20th century, right? It's not that like one group is like better than the other. It's like it's very there's a lot of tension. And so like this is a very fraught, and this is only in Germany. It becomes way more complicated if you look across the world, of course, as well.
Thank you so much. Xin, do you have any last words? Okay, then I think it's time to wrap up. So thank you again, Sébastien, for this wonderful lecture. And thank you, Xin, for joining the conversation with us. And thank you, everyone who watched this lecture. See you soon for another Tokyo College event. Bye.